Before Blue Shift was released, Opposing Force was the only single-player expansion for Half-Life 1. While Blue Shift felt like Half-Life Plus, Opposing Force felt like a natural extension of the Half-Life story and actually added new content. There were brand new guns to play around with, some of them being pretty standard Earth weapons while others are completely alien. Speaking of aliens, there are more of those as well in Opposing Force with the Race X creatures. The campaign offers 12 levels to run around in, and it will take you a couple of hours to beat them. Yeah, Opposing Force is a little on the short side, but this came out around the time where expansion packs for FPS games were huge, and it was the shining example of how to do them right. Adrian Shepard is the protagonist this time, and he is the direct opposite of Gordon Freeman. In Opposing Force, Adrian is a high-ranking corporal in the United States Marines, and he's only 22 years old. This guy is a man's man, and he's become a fan-favorite character in the Half-Life community. Opposing Force begins with him and his teammates flying towards Black Mesa to clean up the scientists and aliens. However, his aircraft gets shot down by said aliens, and he doesn't receive the whole plan of what they were really being sent in to do. This opening is way more action-packed than the base game, and it's welcomed by me. Some people playing Half-Life nowadays might find the tram ride sequence boring and plodding, while Opposing Force gets straight to the point. Adrian also now has a personal stake in the fight against the aliens, since they shot down his ride and killed some of his teammates. That being said, Half-Life 1 does this as well, with Gordon being the catalyst for the aliens invading in the first place. I just love Opposing Force's opening chapter, and the snappy pace of it all is perfect. Before the chopper gets taken down, I like the banter back and forth between the other soldiers, as this type of dynamic definitely wasn't there in the base campaign.
Where the hell are we anyway?
Well, the pilot thought we were heading to your mother's house. So far, this all looks familiar.
Yeah, that's real cute, Jack.
Anytime, anywhere.
So Adrian wakes up and begins his evacuation from Black Mesa. Opposing Force gets right into the meat of the game, and this rectifies one of my issues with Half-Life 1. The puzzles seem a lot more practical as well, like how you need to turn the power off so you can safely pass by without getting electrocuted. In the first couple of chapters, you get some brand new weapons to play with. The wrench is a melee powerhouse, and its secondary fire option does quite a bit of damage and breaks crates open very easily, at the cost of some time winding the swing up. The knife is your other melee weapon, and it essentially acts like the crowbar from the base campaign. I tend to use it more than the wrench just because of its fast speed. Just like in Ghosts and Goblins, get the knife. Instead of a revolver, Adrian gets his hands on a Desert Eagle, and this is so much fun to use. It's strong, it has a red dot scope, and I like the weapon's design. As soon as Opposing Force starts to feel a bit too similar to Half-Life 1, specifically with the underground sewer and toxic waste sections, the expansion throws a new gameplay element into the mix. For instance, at the end of Chapter 2, the player needs to push this cart over and hop across onto the train using the metal beam. Again, this is another section in Opposing Force that doesn't just feel like a puzzle you would find in a video game. I like how this expansion has a tram ride sequence, but they subvert your expectations by having it when everything has turned to shit already. Later on, you get to see your first look at the Race X creatures, and they're a bit of a mixed bag to me. I like the little pit drones that you fight, as they are quite nimble and they keep the player on their toes, but the Shock Trooper and Voltigore are way too bullet spongy for my tastes. I don't think they shake the gameplay up that much to be a good addition, and while it's good to see new enemies in this expansion, I don't find Race X to be a particular highlight. I know that you can use the Displacer Cannon to get rid of the Voltigores pretty easily, along with the awesome sniper rifle, but still, they're annoying. We do get to fight the Black Ops assassins more though, and that's obviously due to how it wouldn't make any sense for Adrian to be slaughtering a platoon's worth of soldiers throughout the game. The Black Ops soldiers can be a pain in the ass to fight, in a good way, since they are elusive and hard to pin down in combat, but you also have the military backing you up. One of the coolest aspects about Opposing Force is how Adrian is assisted by fellow soldiers, and this really helps even the odds in combat encounters. The security guards in Half-Life 1 were nice bullet shields for the player, but the soldiers actually feel like they're contributing and fighting alongside you in the expansion. Speaking of Adrian and his military background, that aspect of his character also ties into some of the game's new traversal mechanics. The player can now climb ropes and use them to swing over large gaps, and this is yet another nice touch in Opposing Force. This mechanic is introduced in Chapter 4, and at this point, you've met with several other soldiers and are still continuing through the Black Mesa facility. That being said, I think Chapter 4 might be the most forgettable level in the expansion, even with the rope climbing sections. I mean, in the previous chapter, you actually get to watch as one of the soldiers sends the iconic Forget About Freeman transmission. This right here is one of the best parts about these Half-Life expansions, how you get to see certain events and important character bits from an entirely different perspective. Regardless, Chapter 5 is where the Black Ops assassins come in, as well as the friendly medic and engineer AI types. The medic will heal you upon request, and the engineer will bust open doors for you. There are points in the game where you need both AI types to live in order to progress, so you will have to protect them from the opposing forces, no pun intended. The combat areas with the Black Ops soldiers are well designed, and you should probably strategize a bit before confronting them straight on. Out of every enemy type in the expansion, I probably enjoy fighting the regular aliens best, then the Black Ops soldiers, and as for Race X, I can take them or leave them for the most part. Like I said before, the Shock Troopers and Voltigores are too tanky, and there's a lot of them to deal with towards the end of the game. Chapter 6 is when Adrian arrives at the Lambda complex and watches Gordon teleport into Zen. Again, I love seeing this kind of stuff, and even though it might cheapen the idea, I wish they leaned into the alternate storytelling more. I didn't know about this on my first time playing, but if you follow Gordon into Zen, an alternate ending will occur with Adrian falling into the void and a special message popping up. I'm glad they actually give you an option to travel into Zen, although you obviously die immediately afterwards. Chapter 7 is located in an underwater lab, and this is a short but sweet level. Seeing Adrian interact with scientists is pretty interesting to watch if you consider that his real mission was to clean up the aliens with the scientists along with it. In Chapter 8, the player finds terrain belonging to Zen in these labs, and you also obtain the alien grappling hook. I appreciate how Opposing Force expands the traversal options as this keeps the levels fresh. The tentacles return from the base game, well, kind of, and they don't really do much besides get in the way a little. Aside from the grappling hook and Zen fauna, there isn't a lot to say about Chapter 8. The next level is just a recycled version of Blast Pit from Half-Life 1, where you need to destroy a giant monster by activating the valve and gearbox. Very clever, by the way. I can do without Chapter 9, and the rest of the expansion goes all in on the combats. There's plenty of fights with Race X and the Black Ops soldiers to keep you entertained, and at least I liked half of the combat encounters. The Black Ops soldiers are dynamic, just like how the military is in the base campaign, and I enjoy fighting them. Opposing Force has a final boss, which is nice, but it's unfortunately not a fun fight. All you do is shoot at this big tub of fuck's eyes, and he then opens up to be attacked. If you repeat this a couple of times, the game is over, and even though the final boss is a letdown, the ending cutscene with the G-Men is incredible.
But there is still the lingering matter of witnesses. I admit I have a fascination with those who adapt and survive against all odds. They rather remind me of myself. If for no other reason, I have argued to preserve you for a time.
Opposing Force is a pretty textbook expansion and gives us more Half-Life similar to Blue Shift, but there's brand new content to enjoy with a completely unique perspective in Adrian. It cuts out the fat of the base campaign, and while I don't enjoy everything that this expansion has to offer, there is still a lot going for Opposing Force. Oh, and before I forget to bring it up, the player can get their hands on a new fully automatic rifle, and this is definitely the best weapon in the game. It cuts down enemies really easily, and the sound effect it makes is wonderful. The only downside is the extended reload time, but that's understandable considering that it's one of the strongest guns. To wrap up though, Opposing Force is brilliant. It sets a different tone from what was in Half-Life 1, and does everything that a mission pack like this should do. But you already knew that. Opposing Force is your favorite Half-Life expansion after all.
My employers are not quite so trusting, and rather than continually subject you to the irresistible human temptation of telling all, we have decided to convey you somewhere you can do no possible harm, and where no harm can come to you. I'm sure you can imagine there are worse alternatives.